The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
So I'm very pleased to welcome Jeff Wasserstrom to the CCCI this week. Professor Wasserstrom is the Chancellor's Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine. He's the author of many books, including Student Protests in 20th Century China, The View from Shanghai, and Global Shanghai 1850 to 2010, as well as many books for non-academic audiences, which the undergraduates will find especially interesting, I think. The 8 Juxtapositions and China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, which I occasionally teach and enjoy a great deal. He just stepped down as the editor of the Journal of Asian Studies and is the current editor of the China Channel, chinachannel.org, which is a repository for new writing about Chinese arts, letters, culture, history, and society. He has 27,000 Twitter followers, and his next project is a fresh look at the global history of the Boxer Rebellion, among other projects. And that sentence is a totally unique sentence in the world, I think. He has 27,000 Twitter followers, and he's working on a fresh look at the global history of the Boxer Rebellion. So this is a rare combination of skills and talents. We're very glad to have him here, and this talk is co-sponsored, in addition to the East Asia program, by the Department of History, and so we're very happy to have him, and let's all give him a warm welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be here. This is my first time in Ithaca, my first time at Cornell University. Though I almost started my academic career near here. My first job interview ever was at Colgate, nearby, and it was probably one I would have taken except for one small detail. They offered the job to somebody else. So it's nice to be here. It was a great visit, so nothing against the place down the road. So what I'm going to do now is talk through some ways to think about what period China is in right now. What the People's Republic of China, since I was in graduate school studying it a long time ago, we thought of 1949, there was a new China founded, a new country called the People's Republic of China. That was a clear breaking point. Before that, 1911, when the Republic of China was founded, was a clear breaking point. And there were other arguments about what kind of breaking points were within that period between them. But from 1949 on, what was clear was there was the Mao period, up until Mao died in 1976. And then there was a reform and opening period that began a couple of years later after the brief time of Huo Guofeng. And that was just what you said, the Mao era and the reform era. But lately, some people have been arguing that we should think about there having been started a new era, a kind of post-reform era, or what I'm playing with, a post-Post-Mao era. Xi Jinping himself has talked about a new era. He's the person who sold the most books who's talked about that, or at least had the most books circulating. How many of them sold is a different question. Carl Minzner has written a book, The End of an Era, and there are other people who are just talking about this, so I'm going to talk through some of that. And these are just some images. There'll be other images thrown up throughout the talk, and sometimes when I remember, I'll put up where you can find them to give some sense of it. I'm working through some ideas from this franchise, China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know. I wrote the first version that's not shown up there in 2010. And there was really no thought then that there was a post-reform era. Clearly, China had gone through a turning point with the Olympics and riding out fairly well the financial crisis, but we weren't starting to think yet of a different change. The 2013 edition on the right, the first updated edition, which Mara Cunningham helped me update and got a hidden credit for, was just after Xi Jinping had become head of the Chinese Communist Party, which is his most powerful position. He later, right when the book was coming out, he became president as well and head of the military commission. And at that point, too, we thought something had changed with Xi Jinping coming to power. But the question at that point, as I'll return to, the question people were asking about Xi Jinping at that point was, would it just be more of the same? Would he be just another colorless leader like Hu Jintao? Or would he restart stalled reform processes? Would he be more of the same, or would he reboot something from the past? And now I think it's gotten more complicated, and some people are asking whether he's rebooting multiple things from the past, or including the pre-reform past, and also whether he's just doing things that are very different. And so when the newest edition, Mara Cunningham gets her name on the cover, as she deserves, because she was a full co-author on this, came out in early 2018 when we were quite clear that Xi Jinping was not a colorless Hu Jintao kind of figure, but the most charismatic and the most sort of closest to having a personality cult that we'd seen in China since Mao's day, and the most powerful figure since Deng's day. So clearly something new was going on. We put it out when we thought the sort of biggest things had happened. He hadn't chosen a successor at the 19th Party Congress. His name of his thought was going into the Constitution, something that hadn't happened to a living leader since Mao. We thought, we had the main big changes on there. And right as we signed off on the proofs, soon after that, he announced the end of term limits went through the Constitution. Yet another thing that kind of underscored that we're moving into a different era, because the notion of regular transitions of power was one of the things that was supposed to clearly differentiate the post-Mao era from the Mao era, when Mao ruled essentially for life. So the question of being back in some ways with some things more familiar to the Mao era, and in other ways clearly in uncharted territory. That's kind of where we are now thinking about Xi Jinping. I'll return to this later, but just in the back of your minds, this is a bit of a quote from somebody who was the Commander-in-Chief of Land, Naval, and Air Forces, Supreme Commander, China Theater, President of the State Council, Chairman of the Supreme National Defense Council, Director General of the Central Planning Body, Chairman of the Party and Political Work. So who is that describing? So you're supposed to think maybe it's describing Xi Jinping, who has accumulated so many titles that Jeremy Barmay, the Australian China specialist, said we should just call him chairman of everything, rather than trying to keep it straight, and other people have picked that up. But that statement is not about Xi Jinping. So I'd be curious who you might think it could be. Yes?
Chiang Kai-shek?
Chiang Kai-shek, we have a ringer here. He cuts there, you're right. And we will get back to that of why I think Xi Jinping and Chiang Kai-shek are worth putting in the same category, even though other people are more often compared to Xi Jinping than Chiang Kai-shek, in part because Chiang Kai-shek was, among other things, a fierce opponent of the Communist Party. But we'll get to some parallels to Xi Jinping, but first we'll work through some other things. The other thing is, there are lots of versions of talks. People give different versions of the same talk, different places. Talks get filmed. So I always want people who are coming to a talk, even this one's being filmed, but people who are watching the film talk to realize this is something that's happening here and it's happening now. So I like to do something in a talk that says about this moment in time and this place in the world. And so in this talk, I'll do some kinds of comparisons that I've done in other places and some that I draw on other people. I'll talk about how Xi Jinping is and isn't like an emperor, is and isn't like Putin, is and isn't like Mao, and is and isn't like Chiang Kai-shek. I'm going to argue that none of these parallels is perfect. No analogy, even though the whole world of op-eds is based on saying, here's the way you think about, it doesn't have to be Xi Jinping, it could be Trump. To understand Trump, think about Hitler, if you really don't like him. Think about Reagan. Think about Andrew Jackson. There have been a lot of different ones sort of, and the whole culture of the op-ed is to fix on one, as though it were somehow an analogy that unlocked things. It's not just people, it's also for events. As we saw with this peculiar thing with 9/11 being described as the new Pearl Harbor and other kinds of things. And this happens in China too, with the talk of a new long march, other things like that. What I'm going to argue for is the value of the imperfect analogy. And saying that because analogies are imperfect, it's good to keep a couple of them in mind, 2 or 3. And I think this is true with historical events. I think it's true with historical figures. I think it's also true with books, including dystopian novels, that people say will unlock a given moment. There have been a lot of people saying, to understand today, read 1984. People have been saying that about China for a long time. To understand China, read 1984. I say read 1984 and Brave New World. And some other things. To understand Trump's America, maybe 1984, Handmaid's Tale, and Lord of the Flies. And maybe you start to get some of that. All of them are imperfect, but think about multiple ones. I'm not going to talk about books, though I could, but the imperfect analogies thing is in this book, 8 Juxtapositions. which I used to think China in the 21st Century is the shortest book I'd ever write. This one's even smaller. You can read it on the plane. The China in the 21st Century you can read on the plane to China and finish it and watch a movie. This one you can read on the plane from here to Chicago. So I talked about some of the analogies that are worth out there, but I'm going to talk about one that's on my mind right now. So in the news right now is what happened to a Saudi Arabian critic of the ruling family. And the question is whether the head of that ruling family, the nominal one, the crown prince, who was being celebrated quite recently by Thomas Friedman, a very high-profile New York Times correspondent, columnist, was celebrating the crown prince as Saudi Arabia's Arab Spring at last, as the reformer that we've been waiting for to bring an autocratic country into kind of the global mix and on a good path. That idea has been shattered by this murder inside the Saudi embassy or consulate embassy in Istanbul, the stories about which are proliferating and making the news headlines just now. Now, the thing about this piece that Emily Rohala wrote soon after coming back from covering China, she's now in the US working for the Washington Post, focused on this. She said in the case of the missing Saudi journalist, the grisly details may be the message. What she talked about was there seemed to be in some of these events, as well as the killings of journalists that have been traced back to Putin, a notion that sometimes something fairly crude is happening, as though part of the message may be to try to get away with the event, but also the other may be to strike fear into people who might think about criticizing a regime. And in that, in part because she's a China specialist, she brings up another event, which was the snatching of booksellers, Hong Kong booksellers, who disappeared in mysterious circumstances and then had forced confessions on state television. And she analyzed one of those state confessions that said you see the bookseller accused of subversion wearing a different shirt at different points during what is supposed to be a single interview, which suggests that it was staged. And one idea would be it was sloppily staged. She argued maybe it wasn't sloppily staged. Maybe people knowing it's staged is part of what makes them fearful about finding themselves in that same situation. So I think Xi Jinping and the Crown Prince have certain kinds of things in common, and the disaffection or the questioning of whether to see him as a reformer and modernizer or as capable of thuggish behavior is something there. So before Xi Jinping became always talked about as president, he was talked about as a princely, and the Crown Prince is talked about as a prince. Before Thomas Friedman was celebrating the Crown Prince as the reformer we had all been waiting for, Nicholas Kristof, another very, very influential New York Times columnist, widely read, was saying the same thing about Xi Jinping. He wrote, looking for a jumpstart in China. This was soon after Xi Jinping ascended, and he made a series of predictions that he thought, it was hard to tell, but he thought Xi Jinping would restart stalled economic processes and also oversee some political liberalization. What has shattered that idea for many people, the way that the events in Turkey have shattered the idea of the Crown Prince, not so the booksellers was one thing, but also the Xinjiang indoctrination camps, into which hundreds of thousands, or perhaps around 1 million of Uyghurs, a largely Muslim ethnic group in Xinjiang, have been disappearing of late. And there are now competing arguments. The Chinese press official press first denied that there were these camps, and now has been argued they're vocational camps, and have been trying to justify them as just an effort to fight to eliminate extremism and terrorism. There's also been criticism of it, though, as a very dark kind of return to a kind of pattern of mass detention in camps that is a disturbing echo of things that happened in the Chinese past and in dark periods in other parts of the world. So that is now something that is, there are different views of Xi Jinping the same way there are different views of the Saudi Crown Prince. And this is more of the Nicholas Kristof article making the case for Xi Jinping as a potential reformer And he said a variety of things. He thought Mao's body would be hauled out of Tiananmen Square on Xi Jinping's watch. That doesn't show any signs of happening. He also said that Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace Prize winning writer, would be released from prison under Xi Jinping's watch. That definitely didn't happen. And the fact that Liu Xiaobo died while still in prison was one of the things that started to raise questions a little over a year ago in the minds of some people who were wondering about a new era. And it was one of the things that got me thinking, along with other things, about just how different things have become. Because in the reform era, over time, even the most high profile of dissident figures were often released to receive medical treatment in the West. That wasn't happening under Mao. After Mao, it was happening. Wang Dan, a key leader of the Tiananmen protests, was in prison, and out of prison, and back in prison, and then allowed to go to the West for medical treatment. Wei Jingsheng, who was the most prominent figure for the Democracy Wall movement, was eventually let out to come to America to seek treatment. So you have a variety of things that used to exist in China and the PRC that didn't exist and now are back. So there's some sense of a return to earlier patterns and some things that are just new. Now that's about what happens now. When I brought up the Saudi Arabian answer, which I wasn't thinking about actually the last time I gave this talk, a version of this kind of talk a couple of months ago. But also, what about being here in Cornell? Well, one of the things that got me thinking about Liu Xiaobo's death in prison and what it meant was a conversation that was held at the website Chinaphile, which is an excellent website. I encourage you to get it. I'm glad that Nick, in introducing me, gave a pitch for the China channel, another one to check out. Though I'm only one of the editors of that, an academic editor. Alec Ash and Ann Hanakowitz get the lion's share of the credit for all the good stuff that's up there. But Chinaphile has been around for quite a while, and one of the things it does, it has conversations where it asks leading experts to weigh in on something that's happened. And in this case, when Liu Xiaobo died in prison, they asked Nick, among other people, to weigh in. And this is one of the pieces that really made me start paying attention to whatever he was writing. And what was interesting about it was there was a lot of people who were talking about it within purely a Chinese frame, what was happening. But he brought up the fact that there were ways in which this kind of event, what was going on in America with threats to freedom of speech and terms for authoritarianism, made it worth thinking in some ways about parallels placing Xi Jinping. Wasn't the first time that people have brought this up, but it underscored this. The idea of thinking about a trend around much of the world toward what might be called a kind of muscular nationalist strongman leader who has little tolerance for critics and has an idea of, to quote our local strongman leader, making X country great again. And Xi Jinping had been talking about natural rejuvenation, which is not that far removed from making great again. So I think there's a way in which, thinking about this new era in China, we should also think about a new era in the world, and a new era in different parts of the world. So to think about this era, Pankaj Mishra calls it an age of anger, but we can also think about an age of strongman leaders and muscular foreign policy and nationalist nostalgia. And that suggests certain kinds of imperfect analogies, comparisons for Xi and others. Also at Cornell is somebody I read to think about how images of the Chinese past, including and mythic stories of history, are repurposed for the present. And so this is an image that Robin McNeil, another of the professors that you who are lucky Cornell students can study with, took that accompanied an article that I edited at the Journal of Asian Studies. And there was also something that Robin wrote that I thought about as I was preparing this talk to think about things about Xi Jinping, which was just a review he wrote, a book review of a book about Confucius, the title, Returning to the Canon, or The Canon Comes Back. One of the things that's happened under Xi and began to happen under people before Xi, leaders, but has been done with a vengeance by Xi, is a return to Confucius and other canonical classical thinkers. There's a forthcoming book, Inside the Mind of Xi Jinping, by Le Monde's former Beijing correspondent, that I think is very good. It doesn't get us inside the mind of Xi Jinping because, in fact, it's very hard to figure out what's going on inside Xi Jinping's thought. He doesn't give interviews really, and you can only speculate, but it's a good job of parsing speeches and other things around him to try to get a sense of it. And one of the key things is under Xi Jinping, there's been, and Comrade Confucius is a nice way of putting it, a notion that you can combine admiration for Mao and admiration for Confucius. And you see, these are shots I took at Chufu, Confucius's home city, that's now been sort of theme parked as a pilgrimage site a few years ago. And you see in the one picture little red books right by the Lunyu of Confucius put together. So the sayings of one influential thinker and the sayings of another. And it's sometimes thought that the Lunyu is now replacing the little red book, but actually in some sense the little red book replaced the Confucius sayings, a small set of sayings, and now they both coexist, is what's interesting. That's novel, one novelty about this era. It's not just a throwback to the Mao era, because in the Mao era, Confucius was criticized. It's also a combination of sort of the old and the new, when you summed up in that kind of billboard there, where it presents an idea of the China that Xi Jinping's imagined as one that respects, is in touch with traditional thought, is somehow in touch with the landscape of a beautiful country, and has state-of-the-art technology represented by high-speed trains. Xi Jinping, soon after taking power, went to Confucius' hometown and talked about how wonderful the revival of Confucius' thought there was, saw books there and said he wanted someday to read them. This was a sort of throwback from under Mao's day, when you had here an image of Confucius as holding China back. This was a cartoon, a comic strip, said this is what the bad old China was like, where the young bowed down before the old, when the subjects bowed down for the emperor, when wives bowed down in front of husbands. The new China is not going to be like that at all. And this was the kind of illustrated picture to say, under Mao's time, why this was a break with that old China. Now when you see billboards, these I took in China when I was there last month, you see a set of images that talk, this is the image for kind of civilized behavior, is a young person helping an older person across a street. And this is what harmonious behavior is. A younger person washing the feet of an older person, and it's not incidental that it's a woman washing the feet of a man. So there's a way in which these are things that we can think about, a revival of some things from Mao's time, but also a rejection of some things from Mao's time. Rejection that was beginning under the reform period, but what's going on is new in part because it's strengthening that revival of things like Confucianism, while at the same time doing some things that are rejecting moves in the reform era, such as term limits. So these are some ideas that I play with in 8 juxtapositions, the idea of imperfect analogies, and these are the various, each chapter has a sort of juxtaposition of two things, often presented as an imperfect analogy. One of the ones that I deal with in the book, that I've done some things related to here, is this idea that that you should be wary of false questions that ask you to fall down on one side or another and sort of present you with just two choices, when in fact in China, in the case of China, so with others, the best answer might be a little of each. So the question was posed, again, to pick on Nicholas Kristof. He sells enough books, I feel it's okay to pick on him. Has a high enough profile platform. But this idea was, would Xi Jinping be a reformer? And the easiest response, or the way in which people were trapped in saying, no, he won't be a reformer, we'll just get more of the same. But in fact, what you got was somebody who might be a reformer in some ways, and something very different in another. Would he be a liberalizer or a hardliner, is the way sometimes, but actually in Chinese history, in the recent past and before, we've often seen people who are both, including Deng Xiaoping, who's thought of as a symbol of reform, and at various times was imagined to be somebody who would bring political liberalization as well as economic reform, but actually showed with the crackdown on the democracy wall and ordering the troops in 1989 to be perfectly ready to be a hardliner in some regards, even while being reformer in others. And maybe that's what we should expect. Now this is to make sure you're awake at certain points in the talk. I need to show funny pictures. Now the discussion about Xi Jinping is quite different. It's not, is he just like Hu Jintao or is he like a new Deng Xiaoping? Now it's more, what is he exactly, a new Mao or a new emperor? Xi Jinping had been compared to Winnie the Pooh at various points, beginning with when people on the internet in China showed great creativity. They saw a picture of Obama with Xi Jinping and noted their physiques and thought that Obama looked a little like Tigger and Xi Jinping looked a little like Winnie the Pooh. And then Winnie the Pooh was scrubbed from the internet, and then later he came back wearing a crown when term limits were over. There was also a point when Xi Jinping and Abe met, and Abe really didn't look very happy, so they thought that was a little like you. So, Willie Lam, who is a very astute analysis of Chinese politics, instead of just having two choices on the cover of his book, he put three. Should we think of Chinese politics in the era of Xi Jinping as Renaissance, reform, or retrogression? And then thinks of different ways in which it's each of those things. If I were really together, I would have thought about the fact that Hu Shi went to Cornell, and Hu Shi is associated with talking about Chinese Renaissance, but I didn't think of that until the slide went out, so I didn't get to play with that. So Willie Lam, in being interviewed about it, talked about what was new, that Xi Jinping was not just the first among equals, he was the big boss, there was a concentration of power, and he gave some ideas of how to think about this. But I think at least when you get into three choices, you're better than two, and when you think about combinations rather than any one of them, it's better. The way I happen to think about it is that we are in many ways in a new era, but this new era, like many others, and we can talk about other ones that even what things created by very clear-cut revolutions that create even a country with a new name, you'll often see a mix of some degrees of novelty, some degree of continuity, and also some degrees of restorations. Even things that are thought of as completely new, to be intelligible to people, often have to clothe themselves in some of the symbols and myths from something old. The French Revolution started the world over at year one. It was supposed to be a completely new system, jettisoned the old monarchy, but it clothed its ideas in images drawn from the classical past as a way to somehow make it intelligible. And there were also some continuities, despite all the claims for complete revolution. And that's, I think, what you'll find if you press on just about any kind of political revolution. But certainly, I think in the case of Xi Jinping, it's useful to think of those. And in thinking about that, it's useful to think about comparisons other than the main ones I've mentioned so far of a new Mao, a new Deng, just like Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin before him, or like an emperor. Those can get you some degree, but you can also think of others. The strangest analogy that I bring up in 8 Juxtapositions is Xi Jinping and the Pope. They both rose to power at the same time, Xi Jinping and Pope Francis. Xi Jinping became president, Pope Francis became Pope in March of 2013, and I happened to be in China then, jet lagged and kind of fading in and out of sleep and turning on the news to different stations, trying to practice my Chinese by listening to Chinese television, able to get CNN because in a foreign hotel, and I would doze in and out. And when I woke up, I found out that whenever I woke up, it seemed they were talking about the new leader of 1.2 billion people or so who had just been chosen through an election, but it wasn't really an election because it was just a bunch of old men deciding which of the old men should lead the place. And the question was, would the person this old guy was replacing, who was even older, would he fade away or would he sort of be looking over the guy's shoulder? And I found out that that could have either been about Francis or about Xi Jinping. Everything I just said is the same. And actually, some people, I never underestimate the creativity of Chinese users of the internet. Tea Leaf Nation, on the internet at that point, there was a translation that, in fact, some people noticed this parallel in China and used it to brag about how much more efficient the Chinese system was, because it took multiple votes for them to pick a new pope. Whereas in China, it was just one vote, and not just a new leader, but a lot of other new leaders as well. So when Xi Jinping started to have more of a kind of personality cult, his picture was everywhere. I happened to go with my family on a trip to Rome, and there I saw Pope Francis's face everywhere, and images of him. And so I started thinking, okay, there's something here. This is a more charismatic Pope than we've had for a while. This is a more charismatic Chinese leader than we've had for a while. His words are being quoted more. His face is everywhere. And when he shows up, his face is often with that of not the previous leader just before him, but of some really exalted leaders before, going back a bit. So I thought this is something that really has some potential. We're updating, my publishers, Penguin, the H Exposition, is willing to do an updated edition with an added bonus track, of an added chapter. And one of the things I had to do when I was writing that was think about, did I want to scale back or say maybe I wasn't so right with some of these parallels I drew. I knew they were imperfect, but maybe the one with the Pope had become so imperfect that it really just shouldn't be used anymore. One of the things that made me think maybe it was problematic is Xi Jinping has showed such a fondness for martial displays. He's overseen some of the biggest military parades in recent Chinese history. He really likes to pose in military gear. That really isn't very Pope-like. There's an old saying attributed to different leaders, but often to Stalin, that somebody said, "Are you sure you want to do that because the Pope won't like it?" And Stalin or whoever it was said, "Well, how many battalions does the Pope have?" As if that sort of answered it. So the Pope does have a little bit of a military guard, but the Pope is definitely not a martial figure, so maybe this was something that really doesn't work. But then I started to think also of ways that it really does still work. There were always problems with the analogy. It's a very flawed analogy. Among other things, the Pope doesn't have a wife who accompanies him on his travels. There are many, many differences. But there are also some parallels. And one of the parallels that I think is interesting is a peculiarity, it seems. I thought a peculiarity of the Chinese system. And I try not to fall into the trap, which is very common of foreign analysts of China, of thinking of something that's going on in China as utterly exotic and strange. But it really seemed to me strange that Confucius would be attacked at one period in the Communist Party's history and then celebrated in another. These are images from the one on the right from the Cultural Revolution where Destroy the Four Olds, Confucius was being smashed. And then in the present period, you have the Communist Party still in power and it's setting up Confucius institutes around the world as a kind of representative of Chinese culture. So it's gone from saying Confucius was a dangerous, bad thinker to saying Confucius is a thinker that we owe a lot to and that we are somehow continuing in his footsteps and we can claim credit for him. On that trip to Rome, we went to the Vatican. And in the Vatican, right before you go to the Sistine Chapel, the most famous painting in the Vatican, you see this painting, which is the School of Athens, which is right before you get to there. And what you see here, it's a very famous painting that, not being an art historian, I didn't know anything about until going to the Vatican and then looking it up. And what it shows is different thinkers from the time it was painted, during the Renaissance, being matched up with great thinkers and scientists, philosophers from the Greek and Roman period. And what's interesting about that is that early in the Catholic Church's history, some of Aristotle's books were viewed as dangerous pagan thinking. And yet, at a later point in the Church's history, they found a way to integrate and claim to represent the whole of the Western tradition, including figures like Aristotle, in the same way that the Chinese Communist Party has reconfigured itself to speak for all of the Chinese tradition as it sees it. So it's still a very imperfect analogy. It's still got all sorts of problems, but I'm not willing to let it go yet. So here are just some of the images that have come out with the analogies, much more common than the Pope, that have been thrown out for Xi Jinping. Xi as an emperor, or a new Mao, or how about an emperor and a new Mao, by being in an emperor's clothing, but in the place where Mao's face goes. Xi as a Chinese answer to Putin, and especially after he did away with term limits, the idea of Putin just staying on and on seemed to be a parallel with Xi Jinping. Before that, people had said maybe he's like Putin, but then again, Xi Jinping will only rule for 10 years. So now, and there are also arguments that he's not, just like Putin. So it goes in both directions. There's an argument back and forth. I don't think it's not an either or. It's just I think it is one of the useful imperfect analogies out there. And Putin, by the way, fits precisely that notion of the muscular, strongman leader who dreams of making his country great again. And he, and so forth. But even with that sort of Xi and Putin being on good terms, it's not just that they're similar, but they're also on good terms. That is partly new, but it's also partly a throwback to an earlier period in the Sino-Russian relationship. Other things have seemed like a throwback in one way or another. With the end of term limits, some Chinese in China were thinking that this was a throwback. It's like the Deng Xiaoping era never happened, because one of the ways that you knew you were past the Mao era was with term limits and more regular succession. So these are various ways in which these analogies are floating. But even when sometimes what seems to be a new analogy, like the talk of Xi Jinping as a new emperor, it actually can be a revival of things that have been said before about previous Chinese leaders, either in sort of an analytic mode or a critical mode. And this image from the 1989 protests was one that showed Deng Xiaoping as kind of a latter-day Empress Dowager, not the official head of the country, but really the one everybody was taking orders from, like in the late Qing period. But I want to make the argument for going back further than Deng Xiaoping, further than Mao, but not as far as the emperors, and figure out a way that I think this has at least as much to offer as most of the others and is too rarely thought about. So I want to finish this talk by playing with the Chiang Kai-shek imperfect analogy. It is still imperfect, but the more I think about it, the more angles it seems to have. And I think when I'm saying this, I'm going to focus in part on Xi Jinping and Chiang Kai-shek, but in some ways, there are parallels from the period from late 1920s to 1949 with earlier periods in the People's Republic of China, especially under Xi's two immediate predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. There are certain things that under those predecessors, Confucius was revived after a period of falling out of favor with intellectuals and progressives. Chiang Kai-shek revived Confucius after a period when progressive intellectuals had criticized him. Under Chiang Kai-shek, it was widely thought, at least late in his time in power on the mainland, that the biggest issue he really had to deal with, the thing that was potentially alienating popular opinion the most, was a problem of corruption within his party in both that period and the recent past. So I'll talk about Xi Jinping's particular parallels, but it's also a broader kind of parallel to recent past. So one of the things about Chiang Kai-shek is not usually thought about compared to any communist leader, because he was anti-communist. He fought against the Communist Party. And if you want to show a shot about sort of knowing you're past 49 when the Communist Party is controlled, as opposed to pre-49 when the Nationalist Party is controlled, you can show this image. If the TV show wants to say that, that's how you know you're in the PRC, not pre-1949. One problem with that is before Mao's picture was there, for a time Chiang Kai-shek's was there. Chiang Kai-shek was head of a single party that was based on sort of Leninist principles of single party control, limited toleration for dissent, and anti-imperialism as driving forces. He didn't believe in class struggle, a clear part of Marxism, just as Sun Yat-sen hadn't believed in class struggle, a clear part of Marxism. But Chiang Kai-shek had a certain number, the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek, and even before him, had certain things in common with the Chinese Communist Party as well. They came out of, in some ways, the same lineage. So that's one thing, that it shouldn't be completely out of the question to look back before 1949. some specific things. Anti-corruption was a problem for Chiang Kai-shek. It's been a problem that Xi Jinping has tried to deal with better than Chiang Kai-shek because he doesn't want to suffer the same fate. Brother-in-law problems. Chiang Kai-shek actually was twice as good as Xi Jinping in one way. He had two brothers-in-laws with questionable wealth. Both of his wives, he had both of them, Xi Jinping and Chiang Kai-shek, had issues with brothers of their wife. And under Chiang Kai-shek, there were two brothers-in-law who were rumored to be amassing incredible wealth. Chiang Kai-shek himself wasn't seen as amassing that wealth, but they were, and they were widely criticized. Under Xi Jinping, though it doesn't get talked about much, certainly not in China, one of the revelations of the Panama Papers when they leaked, one of the things that journalists in the West seized on was revelations about money being moved offshore by Xi Jinping's brother-in-law. There's also a way in which both Xi Jinping and Chiang Kai-shek have liked to present themselves as associated with military values, Chiang Kai-shek most clearly as a military figure, but Xi Jinping also, but have also made efforts to present themselves as in touch with a more kind of gentle side of Chinese masculinity or scholarly side of Chinese masculinity. Xi most obviously by talking about his reading and his writing. Chiang Kai-shek in different ways, though, by talking about trying to elevate respect for Confucius and other kinds of gentle things. Here's the long list of Chiang Kai-shek's official titles from the book Thunder Out of China, which I showed the cover of just before. That was one of the most important Theodore White and Annalee Jacoby's book about what was wrong with the Nationalist Party, what implicitly was driving people toward the Communist Party, and the kinds of problems that led to the transition. But this is a list of all of Chiang Kai-shek's titles, which really could give the chairman of everything a run for his money. Except you see there's a little asterisk there, and it continues. And so there really is. It's a lot of fun to read all of these titles and see that. So the idea that Chiang Kai-shek Chiang Kai-shek's China had some things in common with the current China is not something that was only thought of when Xi Jinping came to power, and certainly not something only thought of by me. Rana Mitter, in Modern China, Very Short Introduction, a book that came out in 2008, imagined Chiang Kai-shek's ghost and Mao's ghost looking down on the China around the time of the Olympics and wondering which side was really in control. And Chiang Kai-shek imagining that somehow his side must have eventually won because of things like Confucius being celebrated, which was something that Chiang Kai-shek did in his time and Mao clearly didn't. There was also a comic book that started to circulate on the Chinese internet in 2012. This is again before Xi Jinping. There was a series somebody had found in their attic of a bunch of before and after images of what China was like before 1949 and after 1949. So before 1949, women were cast into sexualized and oppressed roles, but supposedly after 1949, they were completely equal. Before 1949, before 1949, there were corrupt officials, and then after there were selfless cadres. Before 1949, there was discrimination against the lower classes, and after 1949, there was complete equality. When this was put up on the internet, somebody said, wait a minute, which one are we living in? Because there's an incredible amount of inequality in China now, and there's a return of mistress cultures, and there are sexualized images of women abounding in China. It's no longer the kind of image of a more kind of emphasis on male-female equality. Here was the corrupt officials before. Now, corrupt officials are a big issue again, of course, and Xi Jinping has dealt with that. Oppression from Chiang Kai-shek and American imperialists before, but then after China in control of its own fate. So one of the things I think the Chinese Communist Party has done, under Xi Jinping in particular, but a bit before, is they've said they realize they have a problem with some of these ideas. They haven't done away with corruption, so they better do something about that very publicly, which Xi Jinping has. They've got problems with inequality, that's going to drive Trump. But the one part of the story of what's different from the before and after that really works is a weak China being bullied before 1949 and a strong China not being bullied. After 1949, the Communist Party has tried to do things to mitigate the kind of rubbing of those stories that don't work and double down on the story they think do work. Now in China, a series of images of the sort of what the good society is now that I took recently, just these were on a few different streets, images of equality, trying to emphasize that this is something that's going on now, images of democracy. I like this one because democracy under Xi Jinping means you get to vote, but you all have to vote the same way. Freedom, there's an emphasis on people being freer in the sense of being able to enjoy a good life, less than in the sense of kind of political freedoms. And then there are these images that are sort of invoking old ideas but trying to put a new spin on them, rather than denigrating old ideas and suggesting something totally different. And again, these were the ones I showed earlier. And this is the kind of image around a lot about filiality as a new thing. And this is the kind of image that I imagine even more than when Rana Mitter was writing. If you had Chiang Kai-shek and Mao's ghost somehow looking down on a China, this would not be one that Mao would recognize as his side. If we say the ghosts actually know something about how they died, and you could tell the two ghosts, where is this a picture of? They would say it must be Taiwan. It can't be the mainland. But it's, of course, the mainland now. Mao might, on the other hand, say, okay, maybe this is the mainland. This guy looks kind of like the way I was presented. His face is everywhere. This is when I was waiting to check in to a flight. Going across the TV screen were different images of Xi Jinping's face. Images of his book. You could never forget who is in power now, in a way that you could when Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin were there. But one of the ways in which I think it's worth going back to Chiang Kai-shek, certainly more than to Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, or Deng Xiaoping, and to some degree really to Mao, even though Mao did have a wife who was an important political figure. One thing you have now with Xi Jinping that you haven't had since Chiang Kai-shek is a woman playing a role that's similar to a first lady in the American system. And there's a kind of parody when you see Trump and Xi Jinping meeting with their stylish wives, both of whose fashion is analyzed. This was not something that you saw in other Chinese leaders. And with a less of a historical memory, sometimes there have been references to Peng Liyuan as China's first lady, forgetting this earlier period. Song Mei-ling, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, came to the United States, gave an address in English to Congress that wowed Life magazine. And this is talked about how beautifully she was dressed and how stylishly she spoke. She was such a representative of the country, and they were impressed by her English. Peng Liyuan came to address the United Nations in English that impressed people very much, and her grace and her elegance and her fashion sense were celebrated as well. And all I'll mention back here is that Life magazine and Time magazine, Henry Luce at the time was saying of Chiang Kai-shek, here's the reformer, the modernizer that will make China the country we want it to be, in step with the world, in step with us, that we've long been waiting for, very much within the same tradition as Thomas Friedman's discussion of the Crown Prince and Nicholas Christoph's of Xi Jinping early on. There were images of Chiang Kai-shek and his wife as this kind of admirably domestic couple. In China, there have been discussion that focuses on Xi Jinping as a kind of representative of family values, and the love story of Xi Dada and Peng Ba went viral in the same way that, they didn't have viral things for Chiang Kai-shek and Song Mei-ling. But Time magazine, Life magazine did run a story saying the one thing that makes Chiang Kai-shek smile is his wife. He called his wife Darling so much that security details thought her name was Darling and started calling her that. So I'm going to end with one final thing, switching back to Cornell at this point. I'm not the first one to have said these parallels. China's destiny has been compared to Xi Jinping's on governance. In this book about China in 1943, there's an idea that the parallels between nationalist ideology and China's destiny, Chiang Kai-shek's book, and contemporary CCP rhetoric are striking and more than superficially. The CCP has embraced China's past and encourages the people to embody traditional values, especially a respect for order. The connection there is that was published by Cornell, a Cornell volume there. And then I will end. I bring you back to Cornell, and now I bring you back to the moment. And the thing that would definitely make Chiang Kai-shek's ghost think that this picture being showed must be a place the Nationalist Party controlled, not the Communist Party, is a recent headline talked about Peking University threatening to close down a society devoted to the ideas of Karl Marx. Thanks for your attention.